Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Income Gaming, Cheltenham's premier friendly local game store. Check the link in the description.
A week ago on Warhammer Community, on an article all about Warhammer Total War 3, an article all about new DLCs, there was a little excerpt at the end, a little addendum that said this. Fans of Warhammer the Old World should know that there aren't any current plans to bring Kislev or Grand Cathay to the tabletop for the foreseeable future. Welcome to Miniature Realms, my name's Stuart, and in this video I'd like to discuss what's going on with Cathay and Kilslev in Warhammer the Old World. The Warhammer Old World corners of the internet have been alive with chatter about what that line meant. Many people thinking it spelt doom for those two factions and they would never appear. Many people a little bit more positive about it, and I thought it'd be really interesting to discuss it a little bit in a video. I wanted to take some time to go back and have a look at those original articles when Warhammer the Old World was first announced and see how the reality of what was announced back then, and does that match our expectations now. Do we expect more from what they said in those few articles about Kislev and Cathay than what we're about to receive or may not receive? And also look at the rulebook and all the things that have been released since launch and see if there are any more clues as to what our expectations really could and should be. I'd also love to hear, of course, what you guys think about this as well. Once you've watched the video and heard what I've got to say about it, I'd love to know your perspectives on it and your opinions of it, so pop them in the comments below. So let's start with those early articles and what Games Workshop told us about Cathay and Kilslev and their emergence into the old world.
Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Baron of Dice, premium wargaming dice. Over 500 styles, over 4,000 customer reviews. Welcome to the best dice on the planet.
So this was the first article that really delved into, barely skimmed the surface of a new faction. It was all about Kislev. We had a map of the area, the region, with nothing really on there in terms of detail. And then they talked a little bit about classic miniatures and showed us a couple of pictures of some classics from the past. And then we got some early artwork from Mark Bedford, I believe, and these do look like pretty early concepts, but at the time I remember it being super exciting. Kislev wasn't really covered in all that much detail in the past, and I'll cover that again a little bit later in the video, but this looked all pretty cool. It definitely got the juices flowing. Then about 6 weeks later we had the second update, Old World Update Bears, and again this was covering the frozen northern regions and covering Kislev. We had a repeat of the map that we'd seen before, again with no further detail of it, but at least we knew it was there. We had a picture of a old bear rider, and this was the old front cover of the sort of mini army book that was out in 6th edition. And then we had some new concept art, and we weren't really super sure at the time whether this was for Total War or something that they were working at with Games Workshop at the same time, but we definitely saw the beginnings of some bear riders, and they were very, very careful to remind us that this game was a long way off. The next update concerning Kislev was in July of 21, so well over a year based on the previous time they were mentioned. Obviously there was a pandemic and lots of things causing delays, and I think we need to be very mindful with reviewing how changes may have been made from what we're getting now to what we see in the future. But Kislev had been added to the map. We actually had some places or cities marked on there, and some liveries or some badges of particular factions, and then that was explored further in this article. As we zoomed in on the map, we were able to see some of the areas they were focusing on. So we're obviously working on background, obviously working on lore, and again very, very encouraging. Everyone was believing that Kislev would be on the way at a certain time. And while we had another article in between in October of 21, it was February of 2022 when the next big article dropped, and this was the first appearance of Grand Cathay, mapped for the first time in Warhammer the Old World. Now, I'm not a Total War player, but Total War players will know that it's already been a playable faction there. And the first piece of artwork we saw was this beautiful piece of concept art. And Andy Hoare, who at the time was heading up the Old World project, was the main interviewee for these articles at this time. But it all looks pretty cool, shows us the location of Cathay based on a very, very old cool map that I remember from my younger days. But again, this was more excitement. Wow, we've got Kislev, and now they're adding Grand Cathay as well. And we even got a new map as well. Way off in the distance, we have a map with some regions on, with some names of rulers or factions or sub-factions, and it's all looking pretty encouraging. We even got a closer look at some of those provinces and factions as well. As we look closer at the map, we can see quite a few cities marked on the map. And again, this gives us a real hope that something cool is going to happen and we're going to get quite a lot in terms of Grand Cathay. Then there was again a large gap to October before the next article, and then the articles really picked up over 2023, as we all know, almost monthly for a while, before building to a crescendo in November, December and January before the game was launched, and that was absolutely natural. It was going to build up in that way. But one thing was absent was any more news on Kislev or Grand Cathay. So I can understand that the people who have been following these articles for the last 4 years or so, building up to the release of the game, have wondered why the news for Cathay and for Kislev has just gone, really. So let's start off with the facts and what we do know about the game that was launched in January this year. Back when those articles came out, we knew that they were teased, announced. I'd say the wording would be fair to say that Cathay and Kislev were announced, but we didn't know what else was coming. At that point, we probably assumed all the factions were coming back, and that's not the case. And we didn't really know much about the makeup of the game. Now, we have these 2 army books. We know what 9 factions are in the game, and with knowing that and having those as published army lists, it doesn't surprise me that Cathay and Kislev might not be here in the foreseeable future, if we're going to quote from the article. Now, I think the whole phrase foreseeable future, it being completely ambiguous, and at the bottom of an article about something else, yes, they are linked, they are both Warhammer, but I don't understand why it's there and why you would make that comment. Maybe they thought they might be heading off comments or questions around when's it coming out for the Old World, and they didn't want to answer them. Seems a strange thing, because I bet there's a lot more noise around it now than there would have been if they hadn't commented it at all. So we got this whole debate. We've got people like me making videos about it on YouTube. So it seems a strange thing to do, more because it induces a negative response rather than a positive reaction to something which should be positive. It's a good thing, I believe. I don't know, I don't play Total War 3. I believe it's a good thing for players of Total War 3. And the hope of Cathay and Kislev in the future in Warhammer the Old World should also be a positive thing as well. So let's be a little bit more positive and forward looking for Cathay and Kislev, and potentially other things as well. I think there's good nods to Dogs of War, or at least things like that, with the use of mercenaries, all because of the lore in this book. And if you've been able to spend a bit of time reading the lore, it expands on some areas that it hasn't done before. It's a new time period, there's less factions to talk about at the beginning of it, but because of that, they've picked up on a few things that you don't see in as much detail in the older fantasy books. But I also think that's a really good indication of what we might expect, or at least be hopeful for new factions in the future of Warhammer the Old World. I really recommend reading the lore to the game if you haven't already. The World of Legends section in this rulebook is very, very nicely put together. It's nicely broken up and easy to read, and most of it is familiar. It's the old fiction that we've known before, all of the old lore. There's definitely some minor changes. The game is set in a new time period, but I feel like they've focused on areas that they may have spent a little bit less time on before as well. Even when we talk about things like the Celestial Dragon, then there is more information, there's more references to Grand Cathay than there may have been in the past, which again shows that this faction is supposed to be part of this game, or at least in my opinion. In the timeline section of the book, which again is something that has appeared in multiple editions, there are references to Cathay, more than I believe in the past, for things happening at that time. So again, bringing them in to the general lore of the period, letting us know that this is a faction that's part of the game. The lore expands, as you can imagine, into the main factions of the game, but also into other areas that we haven't seen in so much detail before. We have a section on the southern kingdoms which covers the border princes. Quite obviously we have a border princes Bretonnian army list now, and we've been told that a lot of the game focus would be in that area, so it's really nice to see that expanded. But along with that, there's quite a lot of chat of the free cities of Talia and dogs of war. And we didn't see that so much in some of the recent rulebooks. We even have a discussion on the kingdoms of Estalia. Read those sections, including the one on the southern walls, about how those nations equipped and defend themselves. You'll see that they say they don't have standing armies. They rely on mercenaries and dogs of war. We know that mercenaries form part of the standard army list. We have a percentage to use, but we don't really know what they are yet. So I think this hints to the return of dogs of war in the future, or at least could do. We've seen the return of classic old metal miniatures. We know more on the way. We know the Marauder Giants coming back. The Green Knight has returned this weekend as part of the Bretonnian releases. I think we will continue to see some of these classic miniatures that we love from old. If you're a newer player, you may not have seen them, but they seem to have been received very well. All these classic miniatures coming back, some may be on made to order, but why not open up the possibilities to bring back some of these classic miniatures, even if it is just for a short period, with some PDF rules or maybe a separate booklet in the future, and enable you to play them as mercenaries in your army. The Dogs of War was a 5th edition army book to start with, and we've seen those units covered in White Dwarfs and PDF and Get You By army lists since then, but this was the last version of an army list they had. It'd be lovely if they brought that out as a bit of an arcane journal with just a few of these units coming back. Who knows, but I can see it. You can see this passion within the SDS team and the team behind the old world for these older miniatures. They are fans of old Hammer and older miniatures, so why not bring them back? If the molds exist and the miniatures or the masters exist, we could well see them returning, and I for one would love it. As we move on through the lore in the Old World book, we see more hints about how the game could devolve from the standard fantasy of those 9 factions that we see. We have the Wolves of the Sea, Norska, and maybe it's just the way they're displaying the lore in the book, but it seems strange to do this with its own heading. Now, obviously, Norska could be covered as Chaos Marauders within your Warriors of Chaos army list, but also it describes raiders and merchants, and maybe there's a chance that you could run a Norska army or just have those as mercenaries in an army if they're not fully taken by chaos at that point. Who knows, maybe we could bring back some of the real old versions of Norse, which was slightly different from full chaos. Then we come on to Land of Snow and Ice, and this is obviously the first discussion of the Kingdom of Kislev. And again, why have a section in here fully headed up? Now it's only 2 double pages, but why have that if they weren't going to be included in the game, if it's going to be an afterthought? It feels very, very strange. I appreciate this rulebook would have been written a long time ago, but why have it here still when you could have taken it out if you'd U-turn like some people think, and they won't be included? I think we will see more. And of course that sentiment is backed up completely again by the next section, which is Ruled by Dragons. And of course we have another 2-page spread here, this time Grand Cathay, the Dragon Emperor, the Empty Throne, and the Great Bastion. And we've seen some lovely artwork, which I believe is totally new. Looks like it's part of that concept artwork, or very similar to what we saw dating back to those articles back in 2020. And again, why would they include this still in that level of detail if this wasn't going to be part of the game? I really think it will. I won't profess to be an expert on Kislev or Cathay. Cathay, I don't believe ever were really represented in the game. There may have been a single miniature or 2 here and there. I know Nippon had some miniatures as well. I remember owning a rocket battery, which I think was just one guy, and a rocket. I had that back in 3rd edition, so very old metal miniature. So I don't think they will cover that much. Kislev, on the other hand, did have a range and did have rules for the armies in the game. Warhammer Chronicles in 2004, there were rules for using Kislevite allied contingents, and I believe that this full publication was what was later turned into the army book, in inverted commas pamphlet, and it showed us how you could play with them in games of Warhammer Fantasy. Now, the reason I'm expanding upon that further and mentioning that is because I do wonder whether that could have an impact on how we could see them in Warhammer the Old World. Now, I've already touched on how the dogs of war or mercenaries may return, and the lore in that rulebook really leads them towards something like bringing back individual units or a small journal with a few units in and selling miniatures as made to order, or maybe even bringing out some new ones. Now, that's a hope. That's something they've never announced, but I think it does link, or potentially links, with Kislev and Cathay as well, because maybe they could do the same with those if they didn't go full faction. Now, this is just me spitballing here, really. I think that we will see Kislev and Cathay as full factions. That's my honest opinion, but I'm just offering up other alternatives of how they could do it. Maybe we won't see full army books. Maybe we'll see smaller lists looking back to 6th edition, and that Kislev army list is an example of a way they could go down if they didn't want to make it the largest faction. If you look at other games that are produced by Specialist Design Studio, games like Middle-earth Strategy Battle Game, when they brought out Iron Hills, that was an all-resin army. I don't think they'll do all-resin now in the future. There's so much more plastic things, but that was an all-resin army, but it was a lot smaller in terms of choice of units to the previous plastic armies in Lord of the Rings. Just a little example. So maybe we'll see Kislev and Cathay, maybe Dogs of War stroke Mercenaries as smaller releases. Definitely a way that they could do it. So I'm at the point now where I'm definitely going to start going round in circles if I haven't done already. So just to sum up, really, I think there's a good opportunity based on the lore and based on what we've seen in the army list, mercenaries, for some kind of mercenary or allied contingents to be brought in the game, but I don't see any reason why you'd rush ahead and do that until the 9 core factions are out, and that's the next key linked part. I think they'll be looking to get maybe not all 9, but at least a good chunk of them out before we see anything added like Kislev or Cathay as well. So don't be surprised that they said foreseeable future. I think it's poor wording. Don't think it needs to be mentioned at all, but I don't think because they've said that they're not doing them. I think they're just focusing, especially in this climate at the moment when they're really struggling to keep stuff in stock. We've only got 2 factions. The second wave of Bretonnia is only just coming out. We know we've got Orcs and Goblins on the horizon, but no date yet at the time of me recording this. So why would they be getting the hopes up too much on Cathay and Kilslev? So I think they are coming. I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see them till 1 or 2 years down the line, maybe even 3. We don't know what cycle they've planned for a 2nd edition. If they do a 2nd edition, I hope, and I'm sure that they will, but maybe we're looking 3-4 years down the line before that comes along, and they've got a lot of armies to get out in that time period. So maybe we'll see one, maybe Cathay, maybe Kislev first, launched halfway through that. It's a big splash release, new faction, get everyone on board, and then maybe we'll see the other right at the end of the cycle before they look to launch a new edition. And I hope along the way that maybe we'll be surprised with some mercenary units which take the form of Dogs of War, maybe with free PDF rules for them because they just released the rules as they release the made to order or bring back an old unit. That would be a really cool thing to see, but that's very much a guess. I really believe they wouldn't have put all that work in and not done Cathay or Kislev at all. Now, being super pessimistic, and they can't do it at all now, I think if we make it to a 2nd edition, and an early signs of the popularity of the game would suggest we should do, providing they can get the models out there for people to buy, then maybe those things could be pushed back to then. Maybe that could be the launch of a 2nd edition, and that's understandable. You know, they developed this game during a global pandemic when they put out those initial concept artworks. That was pre-pandemic. They were probably finished, or at least at the beginning of it. So who knows what they would have planned and what would have happened if we hadn't had that as well. And I know it's boring to keep referring back to things like that, but we have to be mindful of it. And the final point on this is his SDS. And I've said this in videos before, but I appreciate you might be coming to this video as the first one on the channel. I normally do painting tutorials, very rarely do talk to camera kind of stuff. And I tend to save these kind of conversations for my Hobby Hour podcast with my friend Dan and chew his ear off about it. But SDS Studio is a smaller part of Games Workshop. The teams that they set working on these games are relatively small. You're talking a lead writer, maybe 1 or 2 assistant writers, a manager, and then miniatures designers that are shared across other areas as well. So we shared across Necromunda and Blood Bowl. Maybe they do some heresy stuff as well. So these people have got so much to do and little time. See, it might well be that they really want to do these, but they just haven't got the time to assign it to a sculptor at the moment, or them to finish working, and they're quite rightly focusing on getting these 9 core factions that they've announced, that they've put out rules for in published books. Absolutely right that they do them first, and maybe that's part of the reason why we got that foreseeable future thing. I just think it was bad wording. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. If you want to carry the conversation over to the channel's Discord, it's a really friendly place, so only carry it over there if you want to talk about it in a friendly, balanced kind of way. If it's super GW hate, you're allowed to dislike GW. I quite like them, as you can probably tell from my tone of this video, but if you're super angry with them and you want to be really hyperbolic, that's cool. Just don't do it in the Discord. But anyone else, you're more than welcome to come over and join the Discord. Check out all the links in the video description. I have a Patreon and things as well. Check out all my other videos. There's lots of painting tutorials, lots of hobby, a little bit of discussion around Warhammer the Old World, and many other game systems and periods as well, because I do some historical stuff. But thank you very much for taking the time to watch the video. Take care, and I'll catch you soon.